The cowboy never planned to cross Apache land. The trail he followed vanished beneath sudden snowfall. And by the time the sun dipped behind the jagged ridge, the cold had become a living thing, biting through his coat and into his bones. His horse slipped on the icy ground and threw him hard. By the time he struggled back to his feet, darkness had settled and the wind howled like a warning meant only for fools who wandered too far alone. He tried to walk, tried to keep moving, but his legs betrayed him, heavy and numb, and the fire he imagined ahead never came. That was when shadows moved at the edge of his fading vision. Two figures emerged from the storm, silent and alert, rifles raised but steady. Apache sisters, he realized, not by their weapons, but by the way they moved together, perfectly aware of each other without a word spoken. He reached for his gun, then stopped, knowing it would be the last mistake he ever made. The older one studied him with sharp, unblinking eyes, while the younger circled, testing whether he was a threat or already half dead. They didn't ask questions. They dragged him toward a rocky outcrop where a small fire struggled against the wind. The cowboy tried to protest, pride pushing him to stand on his own. But the cold stole his voice. His teeth chattered violently as he sank beside the flames. He muttered that he would be fine, that he'd warm up soon enough. The older sister cut him off with a firm voice, low but commanding. "Shut up, cowboy. You're freezing." The younger sister threw another blanket over him, her expression firm, despite the hint of concern in her eyes. "You're sleeping between us tonight." The word stunned him more than the cold. He wanted to refuse, to keep some distance, but his body betrayed him again, shaking uncontrollably. They lay close on either side, blocking the wind, sharing what little warmth they had. The fire cracked softly as the storm roared beyond the rocks, and the cowboy stared into the dark, wide awake, aware of every breath and movement. There was no threat in them, only hard-earned survival and a quiet strength that demanded trust. As the night wore on and the cold finally loosened its grip, he understood that this was not mercy, born of weakness. It was the law of the frontier. Sometimes staying alive meant surrendering pride, and sometimes strangers became the reason dawn still waited for you. Morning came slowly, pale light slipping over the ridge and melting the last edge of the storm. The cowboy woke stiff and sore, the fire reduced to embers and the wind finally quiet. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then memory rushed back, the cold, the sisters, the strange closeness forced by the night. He shifted carefully, embarrassed by how much he had relied on them, but neither woman seemed bothered. The older sister was already awake, sharpening her knife with steady focus, while the younger stirred the fire and warmed dried meat as if this were any ordinary morning. They ate in silence at first. The cowboy murmured thanks, unsure of the right words, and the elder nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. Trust, he realized, wasn't spoken here. It was measured in actions. As they packed their things, he noticed how lightly they traveled, how every movement had purpose. When he offered to help, they didn't refuse. That small permission felt like a test he was relieved to pass. They moved out as the sun climbed, following narrow paths carved by generations of footsteps. The land felt different now, less like an enemy and more like something watchful. The cowboy kept his eyes scanning the horizon, habit from years on the trail, and it paid off. Near midday, he spotted distant riders moving fast, not hunting, not traveling, searching. He warned the sisters quietly, and they vanished off the path without question, pulling him into cover before he could finish his sentence. The riders passed without noticing them, and when the danger faded, the younger sister smiled faintly, the first hint of warmth beyond survival. That evening they made camp near a stand of twisted pines. The fire burned brighter this time, and the tension eased just enough for words to return. The sisters asked where he was headed, why a man traveled alone in weather that killed the careless. The cowboy told them the truth, that there was no place waiting for him, only miles and memory. He spoke of losses he usually kept buried, of towns that no longer felt like home. They listened without interruption, without pity. When they shared their own story, it was brief but heavy. They were moving toward distant kin, away from demands they refused to accept. Choice mattered to them more than comfort. As the flames flickered between them, The cowboy realized that the night before had not been an accident of cold. It was the beginning of something earned, trust formed step by step, watched closely, but real all the same. Swollen with melted snow and moving fast enough to drown mistakes. They reached it by late afternoon, the air sharp and restless, carrying the promise of trouble. The sisters slowed their pace, reading signs the cowboy barely noticed, disturbed stones, broken reeds, tracks pressed too deep to be old. Something was wrong. Before he could ask, voices echoed from the far bank, harsh and demanding, and figures appeared between the trees with weapons held openly. The tension snapped tight in the air. The strangers shouted in a dialect the cowboy couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough in their stance. They saw him first and assumed what was easiest, that he was a spy. A hunter, or worse. He reached slowly for his hands, palms open, but it didn't calm them. One man stepped forward, anger plain on his face, and the situation tilted toward violence. The older sister moved between them without hesitation. Her voice cut through the shouting, strong and unafraid. The younger took a position beside her, rifle raised just enough to warn, not threaten. The cowboy stood still, heart pounding, realizing how easily this could end and how little control he truly had. When one of the men advanced again, the sisters didn't retreat. They spoke of protection, of shared travel, of responsibility taken by choice. It wasn't submission, it was a line drawn in the dirt. The standoff lasted only moments, but it felt endless. Finally, the opposing group backed away, muttering, distrustful but unwilling to push further. When they disappeared into the trees, the silence left behind was heavy. The cowboy exhaled slowly, aware that he was still standing only because the sisters had decided he was worth defending. They crossed the river in careful silence, using a narrow ford hidden by rocks. On the far side, the cowboy finally spoke. He offered to part ways, not out of fear, but respect. Trouble followed him too easily, and he didn't want to be the reason it caught them again. The younger sister laughed softly, shaking her head, while the elder studied him with that sharp, measuring gaze. They told him survival meant standing by decisions, not running from them. No one forced loyalty here. It was chosen, renewed every day. The cowboy felt something settle inside him, something steady. As they built camp that night, laughter returned, light but real, easing the weight of what could have happened. The fire burned strong, and for the first time since he'd wandered into the storm, he understood that staying was no longer an accident of fate. It was a choice he was ready to make. The valley opened before them at dawn, wide and quiet, with smoke rising in thin lines that spoke of life waiting ahead. After days of narrow passes and restless nights, the land felt gentler, almost welcoming. The sisters slowed their steps, taking in the familiar shape of distant hills, and the cowboy sensed the journey drawing to a close. This was where their paths were meant to separate. He felt it in the way the air changed, in the weight that settled in his chest as he walked behind them. They made camp one last time, near a stand of cottonwoods, the fire burning low as the sun climbed. The cowboy checked his gear, already preparing for departure, when the older sister broke the silence. She spoke calmly without ceremony, saying that he was free to go wherever the land carried him next. There was no dismissal in her tone, only respect. The younger sister watched him closely, waiting for his answer, her expression unreadable. He looked out across the open valley, imagining the familiar loneliness of the trail, the endless riding with nothing but memories for company. That life had once felt like freedom. Now it felt unfinished. He told them he owed his life to that cold night on the ridge. But more than that, he owed them honesty. He didn't want to walk away pretending nothing had changed. He had learned that freedom didn't always mean distance. It could also mean choosing where to stand. The sisters exchanged a glance, a silent conversation shaped by years of shared survival. The older one nodded slightly. She told him that no one walked behind them as a follower, and no one walked ahead as a master. If he stayed, it would be as an equal, bound by respect and choice alone. The younger sister smiled then, warm and unguarded, and added that the fire was always stronger when more hands kept it alive. As night fell, the valley filled with quiet sounds, crickets, Distant voices, the soft crackle of flames. The cowboy sat with them, not as a guest waiting to leave, but as someone who belonged to the moment. The future remained uncertain, shaped by land, weather, and the will to endure. Yet beneath the open sky he felt steadier than he had in years. The fire burned steadily, casting long shadows that moved together as one. No chains bound them, no promises were forced. There was only choice, renewed in silence, and the understanding that sometimes the wild did not take freedom away. Sometimes it showed you where it truly lived.